Chapter 3, Part 1 of From Sail to Steam by Alfred Thayer Mahan. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 3. The Naval Academy in its relation to the Navy at large, 1850 to 1860. Part 1. Probably there have been in all periods educational excesses in the outlook of some of the Naval Academy authorities, and I personally have sympathized in the main with those who would subordinate the technological element to the more strictly professional. I remember one superintendent, and he, unless rumor was in error, had been one of the early opposition, saying to me with marked elation, "I believe we carry the calculus farther here than they do at West Point." I myself had then long forgotten all the calculus I ever knew, and I fear that with him too it was a case of omne ignotum pro magnifico. A more curious extravagancy was uttered to me by a professor of applied mathematics. I had happened to say that while it was well each student should have the opportunity to acquire all he could in that department, I did not think it necessary that every officer of the deck should be able to calculate mathematically the relation between a weight he had to hoist on board and the power of the purchase he was about to use, which I think a mild proposition, considering the centuries during which that knowledge had been dispensed with. "Oh, I differ with you," he replied. "I think it of the utmost importance they should all be able to do so." "Nothing like sails," said my friend the sailmaker. "Nothing like leather," says the shoemaker. I mentioned this shortly afterward to one of my colleagues, himself an officer of unusual mathematical and scientific attainment. "No," he exclaimed, "did he really say that?" This was to claim for this mere head knowledge a falsely practical value, as distinguished from the educational value of the mental training involved, and from the undoubted imperative need of such acquisitions in those who have to deal with problems of ship construction or other mechanical questions connected with naval material. His position was really as little practical as that of the men who opposed the Academy plan in general as unpractical; as little practical as it would be to maintain that it is essential that every naval officer to day should be skilled to handle a ship under sail, because the habit of the sailing ship educated, brought out, faculties and habits of the first value to the military man. Still, there is something not only excusable but laudable in a man magnifying his office, and it was well that my friend the professor should have a slightly exaggerated idea of the bearing of the calculus on the daily routine or occasional emergencies of a ship. What is needed is a counterpoise to correct undue deflection of the like kind, to which an educational institution from its very character and object is always liable. That the Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath, is a saying of wide application. The administrator tends to think more of his administrative machine than of the object for which it exists, and the educator to forget that while the foundation is essential, it yet exists only for the building, which is the practical end in view. The object of naval education is to make a naval officer. Too much as well as too little of one ingredient will mar the compound, and if exaggeration cannot be wholly avoided, it had better rest upon the professional side. This was the function discharged by the critical attitude of the outside service, such as my friend of the railroad, at times somewhat irrational, but still as a check effective after the manner of other public opinion, in which in fact it was an instance. In September 1856, when I entered, professional influence was perhaps in excess. The preceding June had seen the graduation of the last class of oldsters, of those who after 5 years at sea had spent the sixth at the Academy, subjected formally to its discipline and methods. I therefore just missed seeing that phase of the Academy's history, but I could not thereby escape the traces of its influence, However transient, this lasted my time. It may be imagined what an influential, yet incongruous, element in a crowd of boys was constituted by introducing among them 20 or 30 young men, too young for ripeness, yet who for 5 years had been bearing the not slight responsibility of the charge of seamen, often on duty away from their superiors, and permitted substantially all the powers and privileges conceded to their seniors, men of mature years. How could such be brought under the curb of the narrowly ordered life of the school, for the short 8 months to which they knew the ordeal was restricted? Could this have been attempted seriously, there would probably have been an explosion. But in truth, as far as my observation went, most of the disciplinary officers, the lieutenants, rather sympathized with irregularities, within pretty wide limits. A midshipman was a being who traditionally had little but the exuberance of his spirits to make up for the discomforts of his lot. The comprehensive saying that what was nobody's business was a midshipman's business epitomized the harrying of his daily life, with its narrow quarters, hard fare, and constant hustling for poor pay. Like the seaman, above whom in early days he stood but little, the midshipman had then only his jollity and his youth to compensate; and also, like the seaman, a certain recklessness was conceded to his moments of enjoyment. The very name carried with it the privilege of frolicking. The old times of license among seafaring men were still of recent memory, and though practice had improved, opinion remained tolerant. The gunner of the first ship in which I served after graduation told me that in 1832, when he was a young seaman, before the mast, on board a sloop of war in the Mediterranean, on Christmas Eve, there being a 2-knot breeze, that is substantially calm, at sundown the ship was put under 2 close reefed topsails for the night, storm canvas, and then the jollity began. How far it was expected to go may be inferred from the precautions, and we gain here some inkling of the phrase heavy weather, applied to such conditions. But of the same ship he told me that she stood into the harbor of Malta under all sail, royal and studding sails, to make a flying moor, which I must explain to the unprofessional is to drop an anchor under sail, the cable running out under the force of the ship's way till the place is reached for letting go the second anchor, the ship finally being brought to lie midway between the two. An accurate eye, a close judgment as to the ship's speed, and an absolute promptness of execution are needed, for all the sail that is on when the first anchor goes must be off before the second. In this case nothing was started before the first. Within 15 minutes all was in, the ship moored, sails furled, and yards squared, awaiting doubtless the final touches of the boatswain. Whether the flag of the port was saluted within the same quarter hour, I will not undertake to say. It would be quite in keeping to have attempted it. System, preparation, and various tricks of the trade go far to facilitate such rapidity. Now, I dare say that some of my brother officers may cavil at this story, but I personally believe it, with perhaps 2 or 3 minutes allowance for error in clocks. Much may be accepted of seamen who not uncommonly reefed topsails in stays, that is, while the ship was being tacked. Of the narrator's good faith I am certain. It was not with hint of one of the stock stories told about the lost cruise, nor was he a romancer. It came naturally in course of conversation, as one tells any experience, and he added, when the British admiral returned the commander's visit, he complimented the ship on the smartest performance he had ever seen. But it is in the combination of license and smartness that the pith of these related stories lies. Between them they embody much of the spirit of a time which in 1855 was remembered and influential. Midway in the War of Secession I met the first lieutenant who held the trumpet in that memorable maneuver, a man of 1813, now a quiet, elderly, slow-spoken old gentleman, retired, with little to suggest the smart officer, at the stamp of whose foot the ship's company jumped, to use the gunner's expression. Such performances exemplify the ideals that still obtained, were in full force in the navy as first I knew it. In the ship in which the gunner and I were then serving, it was our common performance to up topgallant masts and yards and loose sail to a bowline, in 3 minutes and a half from the time the topmen and the masts started aloft together from the deck. For this time I can vouch myself, and we did it fairly too, though I dare say we would have hesitated to carry the sails in a stiff breeze without a few minutes more. It was a very dramatic and impressive performance. The band, with drum and fife, was part of it. When all was reported ready from the three masts, but not before, it was permitted to be 8 o'clock. The drums gave 3 rolls, the order "sway across, let fall" was given, the yards swung into their places, the sails dropped and were dragged out by their bowlines to facilitate their drying, the bell struck 8, the flag was hoisted, and close on the drums followed the band playing the Star-Spangled Banner, while the ship's company went to breakfast. It was the transformation scene of a theatre. Within 5 minutes the metamorphosis was complete. There was doubtless a flavor of the circus about it all, but it was a wholesome flavor, and tonicked the professional appetite. Yes, and the natural appetite too. Your breakfast tasted better, especially if some other ship had got into trouble with one of her yards or sails. Did you see what a mess the made of 4 topgallant yard this morning? An old boatswain's mate of the ship used to tell me one of his last cruise stories, of when he was in the Delaware, 74, up the Mediterranean in 1842. Of course, the Delaware had beaten the Congress's time; the last ship always did. Then he would add, "I was in the foretop in those days, and had the 4 topgallant yard, and if one of us fellows let his yard show on either side of the mast before the order 'sway across,' we could count on a dozen when we got down, just as sure as we could count on our breakfast." Flogging was not abolished until about 1849. No wonder men were jolly when they could be, without worrying about tomorrow's headache. Part of the preparation was to let the captain know beforehand that it was 8 o'clock, and get his authority that it might be so, subject always to the yet higher authority that the yards and sails were ready. If they were not, so much the worse for 8 o'clock. It had to wait quite as imperatively as the sun did for Joshua. Sunset, when the masts and yards came down, was equally under bonds. It awaited the pleasure of the captain or admiral. Indeed, in my time a story ran of a court martial at a much earlier day sitting in a capital case. By law, each day's session must end by sundown. On the occasion in question, sundown was reported to the admiral, or rather commodore. We had no admirals then. He sent to know how soon the court could finish. The reply was, in about 15 minutes. "Tell the officer of the deck not to make it sundown until he hears from me." And in defiance of the earth's movement, the colors were kept flying in attestation that the sun was up. One other hour of the 24, noon, was brought in like manner to the captain's attention, and required his action, but it was treated with more deference. Recognition rather than authority was meted to it, and it was never known to be tampered with. The circumstance of the sun's crossing the ship's meridian was unique in the day, and the observation of the fact, which drew on deck all the navigating group with their instruments, establishing the latitude immediately and precisely, was of itself a principal institution of the ship's economy. Such claims were not open to trifling, and were there not also certain established customs, almost vested interests, such as the 7-bell nip, cocktail or otherwise, connected with the half hour before, when the sun was over the foreyard. I admit I never knew whence the latter phrase originated, nor just what it meant, but it had associations. Like sign language, it can be understood. I was myself shipmate, as they say, with most of this sort of thing, for with its good points and its bad it did not disappear until the War of Secession, the exigencies of which drove out alike the sails and the sailor. The abolition of the grog ration in 1862 may be looked upon as a chronological farewell to a picturesque past. We did not so understand it. Contemporaries are apt to be blind to bloodless revolutions. Had we seen the full bearing, perhaps there might have been observed a professional sundown, in recognition of the fact that the topgallant yards had come down for the last time, ending one professional era. A protest was recorded by one eccentric character, a survival whom Cooper unfortunately never knew, who hoisted a whiskey demijohn at the peak of his gunboat, the ensign's allotted place. To the admiral's immediate demand for an explanation, he replied that that was the flag he served under, but he was one of those to whom all things are forgiven. The seaman remains, and must always remain while there are seas to cross and to rule. But the sailor, in his accomplishments and in his defects, began then to depart, or to be evolutionized into something entirely different. I am bound to admit that in the main the better has survived; but now that such hairs as I have are gray, I may be permitted to look back somewhat wistfully and affectionately on that which I remember a half century ago. Perhaps to sympathize with the seamen of that period, who saw themselves swamped out of sight and influence among the vast numbers required by the sudden 7- or 8-fold expansion of the navy for that momentous conflict. Occasionally one of these old salts, mournful amid his new environment, would meet me and say, "Ah, Mr. Mahan, the navy isn't what it was." True. In 1823, Lord St. Vincent, then verging on 90, had made the same remark to George IV., and I am quite sure if the aged admiral had searched his memory he could have recalled it in the mouth of some veteran of 1750. The worst of it is, this is perennially true. From period to period the gain exceeds, but still there has been loss as well; and to sentiment ranging over the past, the loss stands more conspicuous. Memory reveals every rose, but secreteth its thorn. This is the more apparent when the change has been sudden, or on such a scale as to overwhelm by mere bulk that subtle influence for which we owe to the French the name of esprit de corps. It is the breath of the body, the breath of life. Before the War of Secession, our old friends the Marines had a deserved reputation for fidelity, which could not survive the big introduction of alien matter into the corps. I remember hearing an officer of long service say that he had known but a single instance of a Marine deserting; and as to the general fact, there was no dissent among the bystanders. The same could scarcely be said now, nor of seamen then. The sentiment of particular faithfulness had been nurtured in the British Marines under times and conditions which made them at a critical moment the saviors of discipline, and thereby the saviors of the state. It is needless to philosophize the strength of such a tradition so established, nor its effect on each member of the body; and from thence, not improbably, it was transmitted to our younger navy. Whence ever coming, there it was. One marine private, in a ship to which I belonged, returning from liberty on shore, was heard saying to another with drunken impressiveness, "Remember, our motto is patriotism and laziness." Of course this went around the ship, greatly delighting on both counts our marine officers, who became embodied in the chaff that passed to and fro between the two corps, of which one saying, the two most useless things in a ship were the captain of marines and the mizzen royal, deserves for its drollery to be committed to writing, now that mizzen royals have ceased to be. May it be long before the like extinction awaits the captains of marines. Our own, however, an eccentric man, who had accomplished the then rare feat of working his way up from the ranks, used to claim that marines were an absurdity. "It is having one army to keep another army in order," he would say. This was once true, and might with equal truth be said of a city police force, one set of citizens to keep the other citizens orderly. In the olden time it had been the application of the sound statesmanship dogma, divide et impera. For this, in the Navy, happily, the need no longer exists. But I can see no reason to believe the time at hand when we can dispense with the corps of seamen, the specialty of which is infantry, and shore expedition when necessary. Patriotism, as our marine understood it, was sticking by your colors and your corps, and doing your duty through thick and thin. No bad ideal. In like mingling of good and evil, the oldsters at the Naval Academy, along with some things objectionable, including a liberty that under the conditions too often resembled license, brought with them sound traditions, which throughout my stay there constituted a real esprit de corps. In nothing was this more conspicuous than in the attitude toward hazing. Owing to circumstances I will mention later, I entered at once the class which, as I understand, most usually perpetrated the outrageous practices that became a scandal in the country; the class, that is, which is entering on its second year at the Academy. My home always having been at the Military Academy, I, without much thinking, expected to find rife the same proceedings which had prevailed there from time, to me, immemorial. Such anticipations made deeper and more lasting the impression produced by the contrary state of things, and yet more by the wholly different tone prevalent at Annapolis. Not only was hazing not practiced, but it scarcely obtained even the recognition of mention. It was not so much reprobated as ignored, and if it came under discussion at all, it was dismissed with a turn of the nose as something altogether beneath us. That is not the sort of thing we do here. It may be all very well at West Point, much as what would do for a marine could not be thought of for a seaman; but we were officers and gentlemen, and thought no small beans of ourselves as such. There were at times absurd manifestations of this same precocious dignity, of which I may speak later. Still, as O'Brien said of Boatswain Chucks, you may laugh at such assumptions of gentility, but did any one of his shipmates ever know Mr. Chucks to do an unhandsome or a mean action? And why? Because he aspired to be a gentleman. While I can vouch for this general state of feeling, I cannot be sure of its derivation; but I've always thought it due to the presence during the previous 5 years of the oldsters, nominally under the same discipline as ourselves, but looked up to with the respect and observance which at that age are naturally given to those 2 or 3 seasons older. And these men were not merely more advanced in years; they had matured beyond their age by early habits of responsibility and command, and themselves imbued by constant contact with the spirit of the phrase "an officer and a gentleman," which constitutes the norm of military conduct. Their intercourse with their seniors on board ship had been much closer than that which was possible at the school. This atmosphere they brought with them to a position from which they could not but most powerfully influence us. How far the tradition might have been carried on in smooth seas I do not know; but along with many other things, good and bad, it was shattered by the War of Secession. The school was precipitately removed to Newport, where it was established in extemporized and temporary surroundings. The older undergraduates were hurried to sea, while the new entries were huddled together in 2 sailing frigates moored in the harbor, dissociated from the influence of those above them. The whole anatomy, and, so to say, nervous system of the organization were dislocated. For better or for worse, perhaps for better and for worse, the change was more like death and resurrection than life and growth. The potent element which the oldster had contributed and the upper classes absorbed and perpetuated was eliminated at once and entirely by the detachment of the senior cadets and the segregation of the newcomers. New ideals were evolved by a mass of schoolboys, severed from those elder associates, from the influence of whom no professors nor officers can vie. How hazing came up I do not know, and am not writing its history. I presume it is one of the inevitable weeds that schoolboy nature brings forth of itself, unless checked by unfavorable environment. I merely note its almost total absence in my time. Its subsequent existence was unhappily notorious. A general good-humored tolerance, easy-going, and depending upon a mutual understanding, none the less clear because informal, characterized the relations of the officers and students. Primarily, each were in the appreciation of the other officers and gentlemen. So far there was implicit equality, and while the ones were in duty bound to enforce academic regulations, which the others felt an equal obligation to disregard, it was a kind of game in which they did not much mind being losers, provided we did not trespass on the standards of the gentleman and of the officer, liberally construed. They, I think, had an unacknowledged feeling that while under schoolboy or collegiate discipline as to times or manners, some relaxation of strict official correctness must be endured. Larking, sometimes uproarious, met with personal sympathy, if official condemnation. Nor did we resent being detected by what we regarded as fair means, to which we perhaps gave a pretty wide interpretation. The exceptional man, who inspected at unaccustomed hours, which we considered our own prescriptive right, though not by rules, who came upon us unawares, was apt to be credited with rather unofficer-like ideas of what was becoming, and suspected of the not very gentlemanly practice of wearing noiseless rubber shoes. That intimation of his approach was conveyed by us from room to room by concerted taps on the gas pipes was fair war, nor did our opponents seem to mind what they could not but clearly hear. Indeed, I think most of them were rather glad to find evidences of order and propriety prevailing, where possibly, but for those kindly signals, they might have detected matter for report. There was one lieutenant, however, the memory of whom was still green as a bay tree in my day, though it would have been blasted indeed could cursing have blighted it, to whom the game of detective seemed to possess the fascination of the chase, and so successful was he that his baffled opponents could not view the matter dispassionately, nor accept their defeat in sportsmanlike spirit. I knew him later. He had a saturnine appearance, not calculated to conciliate a victim, but he liked a joke, especially of the practical kind, and for the sake of one successfully achieved could forgive an offender. Night surprises, inroads on the enemy's country, at the hours when we were mistakenly supposed to be safe in bed, and regulations so required, were favorite stratagems with him. On one occasion, so tradition ran, some half-dozen midshipmen had congregated in a room after taps, and with windows carefully darkened, had contrived an extempore kitchen to fry themselves a mess of oysters. The process was slow, owing to the number of oysters the pan could take at once, and the largeness of the expectant appetites. But it had progressed nearly to completion, when without premonition the door opened and appeared. He asked no questions and offered no comments, but walking to the platter, seized it, and threw out of the window the accumulated results of an hour's weary work. No further notice of the delinquency followed. The discomfiture of the sufferers sufficiently repaid his sense of humor. At another midnight hour, a midshipman visiting in a room not his, lured thither, let us hope, by the charms of intellectual conversation, was warned by the gas pipes that the enemy was on the war path. Retreat being cut off, he took refuge under a bed, but unwittingly left a hand visible. Caught sight of it, walked to the bed, flashed his lantern in the eyes of its occupant, who naturally was sleeping as never before, and at the same time trod hard on the exposed fingers. A squeal followed this unexpected attention, and the culprit had to drag himself out. But the lieutenant was satisfied, and let him go at that. End of chapter 3, part 1.